I didn't come to the Black Creek Ranch looking for anything but quiet. I came here to disappear into the vast, indifferent landscape of Wyoming, to let the silence soak into my bones and hopefully, finally, quiet the frantic city noise that still echoed in my head. My life was a series of neatly arranged boxes, my small, sterile apartment, my structured work-from-home schedule as a historical researcher, my solitary walks through parks where I never made eye contact. I had built a fortress of routine around a heart that had grown tired of risk. The ranch was supposed to be the final wall in that fortress. A small, rented cabin a quarter-mile from the main house, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush, cottonwoods, and a sky so enormous it made my own anxieties feel blessedly insignificant. For 2 weeks, it worked. My days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. Coffee on the porch as the morning light spilled over the distant peaks. Hours of typing, the click of the keys the only sound. A long, head-clearing walk in the afternoon. More work. A simple dinner. Sleep. It was monastic. It was peaceful. It was exactly what I had paid for. And then there was him. Cole. He wasn't part of the plan. I had met him only once, on the day I arrived. He was the son of the men I'd rented the cabin from, a man who was now visiting family for a month. Cole was tasked with running the place in his absence. He'd grunted a greeting, handed me the key, pointed me toward the cabin, and said, "Don't bother the horses." Then he turned and walked away, his stride long and confident, the set of his broad shoulders a clear dismissal. From my cabin window, which overlooked the sprawling paddock and the main barn, he was an unavoidable presence. A figure of relentless motion and quiet competence. I watched him mend fences, his body a study in controlled strength. I watched him with the horses, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the clipped, dismissive tone he'd used with me. He was of this place. Worn jeans, a faded flannel shirt, a cowboy hat that cast his face in permanent shadow. He moved as if he were part of the landscape itself, as elemental as the wind and the dirt. To me, he was a beautiful, frustrating mystery. A symbol of a life so profoundly different from my own. He was physical, while I was cerebral. He worked with his hands, creating order from the raw, untamed land. I worked with words, arranging the ghosts of the past into neat, footnoted narratives. The distance between us felt more vast than the quarter-mile of dusty track that separated my cabin from his house. It was a chasm of experience, of temperament, of worlds. He was the strong, silent type, and I was just silent. He probably saw me as some soft city boy, a tourist playing at rustic living. The thought was a small, sharp sting of shame. I found myself timing my walks to avoid him, feeling a ridiculous blush creep up my neck if he happened to be in the yard when I stepped outside. He was a force of nature, and I was just a temporary observer, hidden behind glass. My observation became a kind of secret ritual. I learned the way he leaned against the paddock fence at dusk, a solitary silhouette against the bruised purple sky. I learned the specific cadence of his footsteps on the gravel path. I noticed the slight limp he had when he was tired, a subtle favoring of his left leg. These details were like stolen treasures, hoarded away in the quiet of my mind. It was a pathetic, one-sided intimacy. A crush fueled by distance and imagination. He was a character in a story I was writing in my head, a story he had no idea he was a part of. This carefully constructed distance, this safe and silent observation, was the status quo. I was the ghost in the cabin, and he was the solid, breathing heart of the ranch. And that was how it was supposed to stay. A quiet man, a quiet crush, and a whole lot of empty space in between. The disruption, when it came, arrived on the wind. It started as a whisper, a change in the air pressure that made the old wood of the cabin creak. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue for 2 weeks, turned a bruised, sullen gray. The forecast had mentioned a cool front, maybe a dusting of snow. Nothing more. But this felt different. This felt heavy. By late afternoon, the wind was a physical force, rattling the window panes in their frames. The first flakes of snow weren't gentle, they were hard, driven pellets, hitting the glass with tiny, sharp ticks. I lit a fire in the pot-bellied stove, the flickering light a small comfort against the growing gloom outside. The world was shrinking, the horizon disappearing behind a thick, swirling curtain of white. I was standing by the window, watching the storm swallow the landscape, when I saw him. A figure materializing out of the blizzard, head bent against the wind. Cole. He was moving with purpose, heading directly for my cabin. My heart, that frantic, trapped bird, began to beat against my ribs. A wild, illogical panic seized me. He knows. He knows I've been watching him. The knock on the door was loud, decisive, 3 hard raps that seemed to shake the whole small structure. I took a breath, smoothed my sweater, and opened it. He stood on the porch, snow clinging to the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his thick sheepskin coat. The wind howled around him, whipping a few stray flakes into the room. His face, when he looked at me, was stripped of its usual shadows. His eyes were a startlingly clear shade of blue, and they were fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. "Storm's worse than they said," he said, his voice raised to be heard over the wind. It was more than a statement, it was an indictment of the sky itself. I noticed, I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "The generator for this cabin is old. Unreliable. It'll go out, and so will the heat. Roads will be closed by morning." He wasn't making conversation. He was laying out facts. Cold, hard, and irrefutable. My stomach twisted. I had emergency candles and a few extra blankets. I was prepared to be uncomfortable. I was not prepared for this. For him, here, filling my doorway, bringing the wildness of the storm inside with him. "You need to come up to the main house," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command, delivered with the same calm authority he used with his horses. The unspoken part was clear: "You're a liability I have to manage." "Oh, I'm sure I'll be fine," I started, the protest weak even to my own ears. He cut me off with a look. A look that said he had no time for my city-bred foolishness. "Pack a bag. Laptop, clothes for a few days. Whatever you need. I'll carry it." There was no arguing. The power dynamic was absolute. He was the expert, the native of this world, and I was the helpless amateur. Defeated, I nodded. I turned back into the small, warm room, my sanctuary, now feeling flimsy and inadequate. My carefully constructed solitude was being dismantled by a blizzard, and by the men who seemed to be an extension of it. I packed, my hands clumsy, my mind racing. I was being forced into his space. The thought was equal parts terrifying and thrilling. The distance was about to collapse. The walk to the main house was a battle. The wind tore at us, trying to rip the breath from my lungs. The snow was already deep enough to suck at my boots. Cole walked just ahead of me, his broad back a dark shield against the white fury of the storm. He carried my duffel bag and laptop case as if they weighed nothing. I stumbled, and a hand shot back, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron, steadying me instantly. Even through my thick coat, I felt the jolt of his touch. It was impersonal, a simple act of preventing a fall, but my skin burned where he'd held me. The main house was a fortress of warmth and light against the storm. It was old, built of thick logs, with a wide stone fireplace that was already roaring. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. It smelled of him. It was a space that was lived in, functional, and unapologetically masculine. There were no decorative pillows, no carefully curated art. Just worn leather armchairs, a shelf overflowing with what looked like veterinary manuals, and a thick braided rug on the floor. "Guest room is upstairs. First door on the right," he said, dropping my bags by the staircase. He was already shrugging out of his coat, the confident master of his domain. "Bathrooms across the hall. Make yourself at home." The words were standard, but his tone was clipped, distracted. He was already moving toward the kitchen, his mind on the next task. I escaped upstairs. The guest room was simple, clean, dominated by a large quilt-covered bed. I sat on the edge of it, my heart still pounding from the walk, from the proximity, from the overwhelming reality of being here. I was inside his fortress now. The walls I had so carefully built around myself had been breached. Over the next few hours, I watched him from a distance, even here in the same house. He moved with a relentless energy, preparing for a siege. He checked windows, brought in a massive stack of firewood, organized supplies in the pantry. I offered to help, but my offers were met with a shake of his head or a monosyllabic, "Got it." I felt useless, an ornament, a piece of fragile cargo he was obligated to protect. but being this close allowed me to see things the cabin window never could. I saw the fine lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. When he pushed his hat back on his head to wipe his brow, I saw the damp strands of dark hair plastered to his forehead. I saw a long, faded scar that snaked up his right forearm, a pale white line against his tanned skin. These weren't the details of a romanticized cowboy figure, they were the marks of a real life, of work and weariness and pain. He was no longer just a silhouette. He was a man, tired and focused, carrying the weight of the ranch on his shoulders. My perception of him began to shift, the intimidating facade cracking to reveal something more complex, something more human. He wasn't just gruff, he was burdened. He wasn't just confident, he was deeply responsible. The last task before the sun went down completely was to bring in the final load of firewood from the porch. The stack was immense. "I'll get the door," I said, determined to do something, anything, useful. He nodded, already bending to scoop up an impossibly large armful of split logs. I followed his lead, gathering a smaller, more manageable stack. As I turned to go back inside, a log near the top of my pile shifted, threatening to send the whole thing tumbling. Before I could even react, he was there. He reached out, his large, gloved hand covering mine to steady the wood. The movement was swift, instinctual. But it was the contact underneath that stopped my breath. His other, bare hand came up to secure the logs, and for a split second, the rough, calloused skin of his palm brushed against the back of my hand. It was nothing. An accident. A fleeting moment of contact born of necessity. But for me, it was everything. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. A sudden, dizzying heat bloomed in my chest. It felt less like a touch and more like a brand. My entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. The cold air, the howling wind, the weight of the wood in my arms, it all faded away. There was only the shocking reality of his skin against mine. I gasped, a small, involuntary sound, and my clumsy reaction caused the very thing he was trying to prevent. A single log tumbled from my arms, landing with a dull thud in the snow at my feet. "Careful," he murmured, his voice low and steady. He pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable in the dim, snowy light. He gave no sign that he'd noticed my reaction, no indication that the moment held any significance for him at all. He simply bent, picked up the fallen log, and carried his own massive load inside. I stood frozen for a moment on the porch, my hand tingling, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. I was in his house. I had touched him. And the safe, manageable distance I had cherished was gone, obliterated by a simple, accidental touch in a snowstorm. Later, as the full dark closed in, the house gave a final groan and plunged into blackness. The power was gone. The roar of the generator outside coughed, sputtered, and then fell silent. The only sound left was the relentless scream of the wind. "Knew that would happen," Cole's voice came out of the darkness, startlingly close. A moment later, a beam of light cut through the gloom. He was holding a heavy-duty flashlight. "There are candles in the kitchen drawer." "And a lantern." I followed him, a useless shadow in his pool of light. We lit candles, their small flames casting dancing, distorted shadows on the log walls. The house felt suddenly older, more primitive. We were two people on an island, cut off from the rest of the world. The storm had created a new reality, one with its own rules. Cole was trying to fix the generator connection in the small utility room off the kitchen, working by the light of the lantern. I hovered in the doorway, feeling redundant. There was a sharp curse, followed by the clatter of a metal tool hitting the concrete floor. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," he grunted. But when he stepped back into the lantern light, I saw the dark line of blood welling up from a gash across the palm of his hand. It wasn't a deep cut, but it was messy, bleeding freely. "You're hurt," I said, stepping forward. For the first time, my voice had a note of authority. "It's nothing," he reached for a greasy rag on the workbench. "Don't use that," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "That's filthy. You'll get an infection." He stopped, looking at me with a flicker of surprise. In this one specific area, our roles were reversed. He might be the master of the ranch, but I knew about wounds. My father was a doctor. I'd spent my youth absorbing the basics of first aid through a kind of reluctant osmosis. "Come into the kitchen," I said, my voice steady. "Let me see it." To my astonishment, he followed me without protest. He sat at the kitchen table while I found the first aid kit under the sink. It was well stocked. I lit another candle, placing it close, and washed my hands using the bottled water by the sink. "Give me your hand," I said softly. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then extended his hand, placing it palm up on the table. In the warm, flickering candlelight, it looked huge, strong, and surprisingly vulnerable. The lines on his palm told a story of hard work, of ropes and reins and tools. And now, there was a new story, a bright red line bisecting the others. I worked carefully, my fingers surprisingly deft. I cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe, my touch gentle. He didn't flinch, but I felt the muscles in his forearm tense under my hand. He was so still, so quiet. I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the soft sounds of me tending to his injury. I was holding his hand. His large, calloused, incredibly capable hand was resting in mine. This was a different kind of touch from the one on the porch. This was deliberate, focused, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with care. I was the one in control, the one providing comfort. The power dynamic, for these few minutes, had completely inverted. I wrapped a clean white bandage around his palm, my fingers brushing against his wrist as I secured it. The contrast between the clean bandage and his work-roughened skin was stark. "There," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Keep it clean and dry." I finally dared to look up, to meet his eyes. The candlelight softened the hard lines of his face, and his expression was one I had never seen before. It was a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and something else, something deeper, more questioning. "Thanks, Leo," he said. He used my name for the first time. It sounded different in his mouth. Solid. Real. "You're welcome, Cole," I replied. He didn't pull his hand away. We just sat there for a long moment, the storm raging outside, the candles flickering between us, my hand still resting lightly on his bandaged one. The chasm between our worlds had vanished. There was just this table, this small pool of light, and a connection forged in the quiet act of mending a wound. We moved to the living room after that, drawn by the heat of the fire. We sat in the two worn leather armchairs, a respectable distance between us, but the space felt charged, alive with a new awareness. The storm provided a constant, roaring soundtrack, isolating us completely. There was no television, no internet, no phone service. No distractions. There was only the fire, the shadows, and the unfolding conversation. It started slowly, with simple questions about the storm, about the ranch. But the usual barriers were gone. The primitive, elemental nature of our situation seemed to strip away the need for pretense. I found myself telling him about my research, about the book I was trying to write, about the suffocating noise of the city I had fled. I admitted I'd come here to feel small, to be humbled by the landscape. "It does that," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Humbles you. Or breaks you." I looked at the white bandage on his hand, then at the pale scar on his forearm. "Is that how you got the scar?" I asked, the question bolder than any I would have dared to ask just a day before. He was silent for a long moment, and I thought I had overstepped. That he would retreat back into his gruff shell. But then he spoke, his voice low and rough with memory. "Rodeo," he said. "Bull riding." A long time ago, he traced the line of the scar with a finger from his other hand. The bull one. Broke my arm, my collarbone, 2 ribs. Doctor said I was lucky. Lucky. Lucky I could still walk, he said, a bitter edge to his voice. That was the end of that dream. Came back here to the ranch. This was always the plan, eventually. The bull just sped up the timeline. He looked at me, a flicker of old pain in his eyes. "This place, it's my whole world. But sometimes it feels like a cage." The confession hung in the air between us, raw and unexpected. He had just shown me a piece of his brokenness, the dream that had died and left a scar. He, the man I had seen as the epitome of strength and self-sufficiency, was lonely. The word wasn't spoken, but I heard it in the quiet rasp of his voice, saw it in the way he stared into the fire as if searching for something he had lost. I know what you mean, I said softly. My cabin is my world right now. But it's a cage I built for myself. He turned his gaze from the fire to me. I thought you were just another city guy, he admitted, his voice quiet. Figured you were looking down on all this. On me. No, I said, shaking my head. Never. I was intimidated. I think I was jealous. A small, humorless smile touched his lips. Jealous of what? The debt. The 16-hour days. The smell of manure. Of belonging somewhere, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. You fit here. You're a part of it. I've never felt like I truly belonged anywhere. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything we had just said, of the truths we had laid bare. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of embers against the screen. Cole shifted in his chair, turning more fully toward me. I was wrong about you, he said, his voice low and serious. You're quiet. I thought it was arrogance. But it's not. It's just quiet. He seemed to be testing the word, trying to understand it. I like the quiet. My breath hitched in my throat. He liked my quiet. He had seen the very thing I used as a shield, the thing I thought made me invisible, and he had found value in it. The space between our chairs suddenly felt impossibly vast. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken questions. I could feel the pull of him, a gravitational force I was powerless to resist. He was watching me, his blue eyes intense in the firelight, searching my face for something. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. It was a slow, hesitant drift, a magnetic pull across the small space that separated us. He stood up, and I stood up. We were standing in front of the hearth, the heat of the fire on our backs, the storm a distant roar. He reached out, not to my hand this time, but to my face. His calloused thumb brushed gently against my cheek, a touch so tender it made my knees feel weak. It was a question. His eyes asked the question, his lips did not. My answer was to lean into his touch, to close my eyes for just a second. It was all the permission he needed. He moved slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I couldn't have moved if the house were on fire. He lowered his head, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a kiss of passion or frantic desire. It was a kiss of discovery. It was slow, hesitant, searching. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke. It was the feel of a day's worth of stubble against my smooth skin. It was gentle and honest, and it felt like coming home to a place I had never been. He was exploring my mouth with a quiet reverence, and I was responding with a desperate, starved hunger I hadn't known I possessed. The kiss was a confession, a conversation, an answer. It shattered my carefully constructed world into a million brilliant, glittering pieces. The morning came with a blinding, silent whiteness. The storm had passed, leaving a world remade in snow and stillness. I woke slowly, disoriented. I was on the couch, tangled in a thick wool blanket. The fire was a heap of gray ash. The house was cold and profoundly silent. And he was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of sleep. I sat up, my heart starting its frantic, familiar rhythm of fear. My mind raced, replaying the night before. The conversation. The kiss. More kisses. The way we had eventually ended up here, on the couch, not wanting to break the spell by retreating to separate rooms. We hadn't done much more than kiss and hold each other, falling asleep to the sound of the fire and the wind. It had felt perfect. Real. Now, in the stark morning light, it felt like a dream. A foolish, impossible dream. I saw it then. A piece of paper on the rough-hewn coffee table. A note. My stomach clenched as I reached for it. My hands were trembling. I was braced for the apology, the explanation, the gentle letdown. Last night was a mistake. Let's just forget it happened. The note was written in a blocky, masculine script. It contained only 5 words. Had to check the herd. That was it. No tenderness. No acknowledgement of what had passed between us. Just a statement of fact. A chore. The wrench came first. It was a dismissal, as clear and sharp as the one he'd given me on my first day. The intimacy of the storm had been a temporary illusion. Now the sun was out, and reality had returned. A wave of shame so powerful it made me nauseous washed over me. I had been a fool. A diversion. A moment of storm-induced cabin fever for him. For me, it had been a revelation. The disparity of that feeling was a physical ache in my chest. I had let him in. I had let down all my walls, and he had just walked out, leaving them in rubble. I scrambled off the couch, my movements jerky and panicked. I had to get out of his house. Out of his space. I couldn't bear the thought of him coming back and finding me here, a pathetic reminder of his momentary lapse in judgment. The silence of the house was suffocating. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to mock me. I felt exposed, raw, like a nerve ending scraped against stone. I fled upstairs to the guest room, my sanctuary turned prison. The solitude I had once craved now felt like a punishment. Before, it had been a choice. Now, it was an abandonment. The quiet was no longer peaceful, it was filled with his absence. The room was cold, but I was colder, a deep, internal chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I threw my things back into my duffel bag with frantic, clumsy movements. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My mind was a whirlwind of self-recrimination. Stupid. So stupid. You read everything wrong. You always read everything wrong. I could hear noises from outside. The crunch of boots on snow. The low rumble of a tractor starting up. He was out there, back in his world, a world where I clearly didn't belong. The hours stretched into an eternity. I sat on the edge of the bed, my packed bag at my feet, a prisoner waiting for the guard to change. I just needed him to be gone long enough for me to slip out, to make my way back to my cabin and lick my wounds in private. The silence inside the house stretched, taut and unbearable. It was a physical weight pressing down on me, crushing the fragile hope that had bloomed in the firelight. The retreat was complete. The chasm between us had opened up again, wider and more terrifying than ever before. I was zipping my bag for the third time, my nerves completely shredded, when I heard the back door open and close downstairs. Footsteps, heavy and tired, crossed the kitchen floor. Then, silence. He was back. My body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. Was he going to come up? Was he going to ignore me? My mind spun with a dozen horrible scenarios. The minutes crawled by. Nothing. The silence from downstairs was definitive. He was leaving me alone. He was letting me retreat. It was exactly what I thought I wanted, but it felt like a sentence. Fine. If he wouldn't bridge the distance, I would. I would go downstairs, offer a polite, brittle thank you for his hospitality, and leave. I would reclaim my dignity, what little of it was left. I squared my shoulders, took a deep, shaky breath, and stood up. My hand was on the doorknob when I heard the footsteps on the stairs. Slow. Heavy. Hesitant. My heart leaped into my throat. He was coming. I froze, my hand still on the knob, unable to turn it, unable to let go. A soft knock. Once. Twice. I couldn't speak. The sound was too gentle, too uncertain. It didn't fit the narrative of callous dismissal I had spent all morning constructing. The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. Leo. His voice. It wasn't clipped or commanding. It was quiet. And it sounded nervous. I forced my hand to turn the knob. I opened the door. Cole stood in the hallway, looking as wrecked as I felt. His hat was gone, his hair was a mess, and there were dark circles of exhaustion under his eyes. His confident, imposing presence had vanished. In its place was a man who looked vulnerable, uncertain, and deeply, profoundly tired. He looked as scared as I was. His eyes flickered from my face to the packed bag sitting by my feet. A muscle in his jaw clenched. The sight of it seemed to wound him. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of defeat. I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. He looked at the floorboards, at the wall, anywhere but at me. He struggled, searching for words. This man, who was so eloquent in his actions, was lost in the landscape of language. I'm not. I'm not good at this, he started, his voice a low rumble of frustration. This, talking stuff, he finally met my eyes, and the raw honesty in them was staggering. I woke up this morning, and you were there, sleeping. And I panicked. The confession was so simple, so unexpected, it knocked the air out of my lungs. I've never, he trailed off, shaking his head. I've never felt like I did last night. And it scared the hell out of me. I didn't know what to do. The cattle, the fences, that's easy. I know what to do. But, this, he gestured vaguely at the space between us. I didn't know the rules. So I ran. I ran to something I knew how to fix. He took a hesitant step closer. I didn't leave because I regretted it, Leo. I left because I was terrified you would. I thought I'd come back and you'd be gone, and I couldn't, he swallowed hard. I couldn't face that. The entire narrative of rejection and shame I had built in my head crumbled into dust. He hadn't been dismissing me. He had been protecting himself. He had been just as scared, just as uncertain, as I was. We were two solitary men, terrified of the very connection we both desperately craved. I thought you regretted it, I whispered, the words rusty from disuse. The note. The note was stupid, he said immediately. I'm an idiot. I should have. I don't know what I should have done. Woken you up. Made you coffee. All I knew was that if I stayed, I was going to say something wrong. Or do something wrong. It was easier to go fix a fence. We stood there in the quiet hallway, the truth finally laid bare between us. All the fear. All the misunderstanding. I don't want you to go back to the cabin, he said, his voice low and earnest. Not unless you want to. He held out his hand. His big, work-roughened, bandaged hand. It wasn't for a handshake. It wasn't a gesture of casual friendship. It was an offering. A lifeline. A plea. My own hand, which was still trembling slightly, rose to meet his. I placed my palm in his, and his fingers wrapped around mine, warm and strong and sure. The connection was instantaneous, a circuit completed. The fear that had been a cold knot in my stomach began to dissolve. Stay, he said, his blue eyes holding mine. It was the single most beautiful word I had ever heard. Later that evening, after a dinner eaten in a comfortable, easy silence, we stood by the fireplace again. He didn't offer me the guest room. He didn't assume I would return to the couch. He just looked at me, a quiet question in his eyes. My room's warmer, he said, the words a clumsy, beautiful invitation. It was the most profound symbolic gesture he could have made. He wasn't just offering me a place to sleep. He was offering me his space. His private world. He was inviting me past the final barrier, into the very heart of his fortress. And this time, I walked in without any fear at all. The days that followed the storm were quiet, gentle, and transformative. The new beginning didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the soft, steady rhythm of shared domesticity. It was in the small, unremarkable moments that the real intimacy was forged. It was in waking up, not to a cold and empty house, but to the solid warmth of Cole's body next to mine. That first morning, I opened my eyes to find him watching me, a small, sleepy smile on his face. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for years was simply gone. Replaced by a profound sense of peace. Of rightness. It was in making coffee together in the kitchen, moving around each other in an easy, unspoken choreography. Me, grinding the beans. Him, filling the pot with water. Our hands would brush as we reached for the same cupboard, and instead of a jolt of panic, there was just a pleasant, familiar spark. We ate our meals at the kitchen table, the silence between us no longer a void to be filled, but a comfortable space for shared thoughts. He would tell me about the day's work on the ranch, the stubbornness of a particular calf, the unending task of mending fences. And I would tell him about my book, about the long-dead historical figures I was trying to bring to life. He listened with a focused intensity that made me feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in my life. One afternoon, I followed him out to the barn. He was grooming one of the horses, his movements sure and gentle. He showed me how to hold the brush, how to speak to the animal in a low, calming voice. I was clumsy, awkward, a city boy completely out of his element. But he was patient, his large hands guiding mine, his body close behind me. I could feel the heat of him, smell the scent of hay and horse and the faint, clean scent of his skin. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet life of the barn, I felt more at home than I ever had in my sterile city apartment. The anxiety of the morning after never returned. Each day, he was just there. A constant, steady presence. We fell asleep every night tangled together, and we woke up every morning the same way. The fear of abandonment, the deep-seated belief that I was destined for solitude, began to recede, like a ghost in the morning light. He was real. This was real. I didn't move back to the cabin. My things remained in the guest room, but I never slept there again. My laptop found a permanent home on a corner of the big kitchen table. The fortress of my routine was gone, replaced by the richer, more complex patterns of a shared life. My solitary walks became shared walks, his long stride easily matching my shorter one, his dog trotting happily at our heels. I look back now on the man I was when I first arrived at Black Creek Ranch. That quiet, guarded person who believed that safety lay in solitude, that peace could only be found in the absence of others. I had come here seeking an escape from the world, but what I found was a reason to finally join it. Cole was the plot twist I never saw coming. He was the storm that tore down all my carefully constructed walls. I came here to write a story about the past, and instead, I found the beginning of my own future. The quiet I had been searching for wasn't the absence of noise. It was this. It was the steady beat of another person's heart next to yours in the dark. It was the comfortable silence of two people sharing a space, needing no words to understand each other. It was the profound, unshakable peace of knowing you are no longer alone. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed the direction of your life, a single event that divided your story into a before and an after? Let me know in the comments below about a time you took a risk that led to something beautiful and unexpected. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more tales of love, connection, and the surprising journeys of the heart.